Welcome back. Michael Brooks Show. Michael Brooks here. This is a very important standalone segment with our great friend, frequent collaborator, and conspirator, Ana Kasparian. She's the co-host and executive producer at The Young Turk. She also hosts No Filter. Ana, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Michael. It's always a pleasure.
Ana, big news on the Medicare For All front this past week. You've been saying for a long time that you're the only person in this game who has read the whole Medicare For All bill. And you're like 75% right. I've worked my way through like 75, or excuse me, you're mostly still right. I've read about like 75% of that bill now. Before we get to what Elizabeth Warren outlined, can you actually remind everybody what is in the Sanders bill in terms of coverage, the funding mechanisms that he mentions, and just how comprehensive it is, but also strategically and politically open in terms of some important details?
Sure. So I think it's important to talk about the legislation itself and then also the supplemental proposals that he's put out in terms of how he would fund it, right? So with Medicare For All, it is incredibly comprehensive. He is the only presidential candidate who's actually written legislation pertaining to Medicare For All. And in terms of its coverage, it would cover literally everything with the exception of, let's say, elective cosmetic surgery. And I say elective because if you're in a situation where you're in a terrible accident and you need cosmetics, reconstructive surgery as a result of that, then it would be covered. But if you're just wanting to change the look of your face for cosmetic purposes, then, it wouldn't cover that. So it covers dental, vision, mental health care. Everything you could imagine is covered under Bernie's proposal of Medicare For All. Now, in terms of the legislation itself, he does talk about a federal mechanism that would pay out the payments to the healthcare providers. I forget the exact name that he gave that federal mechanism. But what he doesn't do in his legislation is he doesn't get into, this granular explanation of how it would be funded, because the fact of the matter is there are multiple ways to fund it. And this is really the type of thing that gets negotiated in Congress anyway. However, well before Elizabeth Warren put out her proposal on how to pay for Medicare For All, Bernie Sanders had actually done the exact same thing, with the exception of, giving multiple different options without attaching himself to one narrow way of funding Medicare For All. So if you go to his Senate website, you'll find the options to finance Medicare For All. And he provides a lot of different options, a lot of different sources of revenue. And I really think that that was the savvy way to do it, because once you get granular, like Warren did, you open yourself up to the type of nitpicking, and nitpicking isn't even the right word. You open yourself up to becoming a target-rich environment, right? And that's exactly what happened with Warren. People have been critiquing her, criticizing her. And what I don't get is how people are surprised that this would happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I do want to get to the politics of it in important ways that I think reveal big Warren weaknesses, and also, again, some of the just immense double standards that are applied to Bernie Sanders. But, before we get there, and I think you do a really good job at this in terms of, I think you and I were both skeptical about Warren's sort of commitment to Medicare For All, although I do think she'd sort of rhetorically put herself in a pretty tight bind. And I don't think that, for all my criticisms of her, she's not going to be as disingenuous as a Buttigieg or a Harris or a Yang and just say it's Medicare For All. And, I at a certain point, I was thinking like, no, she probably won't just put out like a public option. But that being said, there's one area I want to get to, but what is this Medicare head tax? What is the most regressive thing that she's proposing, and why is she doing it?
Right. So Elizabeth Warren has made a political calculation to avoid saying that she is going to increase middle-class taxes in order to help pay for Medicare for All. I think that that was a poor calculation because in the current political climate where people are paying very close attention to what you're doing and what you're saying, the fact of the matter is people are going to know that you're still going to raise middle-class taxes, but you're going to do it in an indirect way. And that is what the Medicare Head Tax is. That's part of her proposal to finance Medicare for All. And essentially what it would do is it would have employers who provide health care for their employees contribute that money to the federal government as opposed to private insurers in order to help pay for Medicare for All. Now, that makes all the sense in the world. However, the way that it would work is instead of doing a Medicare payroll tax, which would charge based on the percentage of a worker's income, what the head tax would do is have like a flat tax for each individual employee. And just to simplify this, think about it as, you know, you have two different companies. Company A has 100 employees and, you know, every single one of them is making, you know, minimum wage, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have Company B where 100 employees are making $100,000 a year. In both cases, both employers would actually contribute the exact same amount under the Medicare head tax. And one of the issues is there are loopholes written in her proposal. So, for instance, the tax would not apply to contractors. So that really gives employers an incentive to keep people off of their payroll and just hire them as contractors, which is disastrous.
Yep.
And it also exempts employers who have 50 employees or less. So there are all sorts of tricks and games that employers can play to ensure that, you know, they don't hire more than 50 individuals on their payroll.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, like, just how, I mean, honestly, just foolish this kind of game playing is on two levels. Because, one, Warren made a really strong point of, and, you know, every single debate, all of the idiots at all the networks always ask the same tax question. They have no other question about healthcare. It's Medicare for All, is that going to raise taxes? There's some variation of the same question repeated multiple times at every single debate. And I've sympathized with Warren's sort of like, that's a foolish way to frame it, right? Her response of like, let's just talk about costs. There isn't like a magical area that says taxes and, you know, non-taxes. There's cost versus non-cost. Now, of course, Sanders makes the same argument without this other need that Warren has, which is like this pathological fear of taxing the middle class. It's like this very 90s fixation. So she can't just say, yes, they'll go up on the top end, but overall, a vast majority of the population will save money. So she's caught in this double bind, and that's led to this very regressive funding mechanism, which incidentally, and, you know, kind of hilariously, it's like people in a Democratic primary, I think you're right, a lot of people paying close attention. They're going to see a problem with it. And then what's going to go to a general election and say Warren is the nominee? What, you know, is Trump going to go, oh, well, you know, obviously I can't use that because that's technically not a tax because it didn't hit people's payroll. So we got to be really scrupulous in how we attack her plan. Like, I don't know what they're thinking.
Yeah, I worry about Warren's political instincts.
Right.
Because now I feel that she's really setting herself up for failure. So let's say best case scenario for Warren, she wins, she becomes president, and, you know, she's able to pass Medicare for All, right? So first, let me just say that's a huge victory for progressives overall, and that would be wonderful. However, if she actually funds it the way that she's proposed, middle-class workers are going to notice their taxes going up through this indirect tax, right? Yeah. And so I feel like she's setting herself up for an Obama moment. You know, Obama famously said in regard to the Affordable Care Act that people wouldn't lose their insurance. If they like their insurance, they can keep it. Now, a lot of people did lose their insurance, and to be fair, that insurance was replaced with far better healthcare insurance. But nonetheless, it was spun as Obama lied, and it really did hurt him politically. I think that Warren is doing the same here. Same thing here. And one other thing that I've noticed about Warren is that she gets baited into the framing of her opponents, and she shouldn't do that, right? It happened with Donald Trump and the whole Pocahontas thing. Yep. She played right into it, and she shouldn't have done that. And when it comes to releasing a very specific financing proposal, I really don't think that was a politically savvy move either. Look, it's savvy in that at least now we know that she does genuinely support Medicare for All. I was skeptical about her intentions there. But when you attach yourself to a very specific, narrow way of funding it, well, it's going to hurt you politically, and I see that happening right now. I think that, and here's one other thing. So when she started getting criticism, people like Representative Jayapal, who I have a great deal of respect for, went on Twitter and said, these are just pay-for options. This isn't actual legislation. Don't get too up in arms about these very specific, mechanisms to pay for Medicare for All. But then at the same time, you have Warren arguing over and over again that she's the only one who's thought about how to pay for this.
Right.
But that's not true. Okay, based on how Jayapal has read this, Bernie Sanders is actually the person who put out the options to finance Medicare for All well before Warren did. And the thing that frustrates me is, A, he never gets any credit for that, and B, he doesn't fight back against these ridiculous claims. He needs to fight back.
I agree with you completely. And I think that, especially because now, look, we're in a competitive contest. The reality is that she's built a brand on these Medium posts. And I own that I'm less enamored by them than other people. I think, the Sanders strategy of you build a fundamental argument, you assemble a movement and a case for change, and then you sort of wheel out these actually really clear blueprints and mission statements is way more compelling than some like wonky blog posts that don't have a strategy attached to them. But this is another problem right now, right? Is that there is this tendency to oscillate between I have all of the magical answers and I have like a special patented calculator that nobody else has. And then like, whoa. Yeah, we might do it in a regressive way and we might not. This is just a Medium post.
Yeah. I don't, look, to be fair, she and Bernie have been pretty good about not attacking each other like viciously or anything like that. I just don't like the fact that she has decided to kind of like ride on the coattails of Bernie's Medicare for All plan and then make these declarations that she's the only one who's really considered how to pay for it. Right. It's just not true, right? It's dishonest, and I don't think that it's fair to Bernie, especially since, again, he had put out options for how to finance it. And then one thing that stood out to me, and I don't know, maybe this is just my pet peeve and it means absolutely nothing. She noted the economists that she relied on to help her come up with the numbers, how much it's going to cost, how much we would need to raise in revenue to pay for it. And she noted one expert who used to work at the IMF.
Yep.
And look, maybe I shouldn't read too much into it, but like the IMF goes around, like they're loan sharks. You know what I'm saying? Like they go to other countries and they push for austerity just so these governments can pay back the loans that the IMF has given them. And I don't know if I would rely on someone who's attached to that organization to help me work out the numbers.
I think that's totally fair. And I think that she has, she is the simplest way in my view is that she is the progressive part of the establishment, for lack of a better word. And it is a different mentality. I was talking with Joshua Kahn Russell about this, who I've mentioned a lot. And I think that the appeal of the Sanders campaign really is, whether or not you're an academic or in media or you're, the ice cream guy that always goes around with Bernie, You're on some level, you're saying, I just recognize, like, I want to stand next to a person who is savagely exploited by Walmart and work for a common political goal. And I do think that the mindset of the Warren campaign and a lot of the support around Warren is still very much like, I want to sit in a room with very clever, very credentialed people and think about how we could help people at Walmart. And that's a nice intention. I mean, people sometimes confuse the critiques I have of that as like, that's not bad compared to other things, but that is not a broader commitment to a shared democratic undertaking. And I also think that, I mean, I don't want them to viciously go against each other, but I think you're totally right. Like, the Sanders campaign has been playing with both hands behind its back. And the subtext of all of Warren's stuff is, I have this magical wonk scenario that gets you where you want to go, and Bernie doesn't. And actually, in reality, we either have Bernie having a more strategic position politically in terms of running a campaign, or frankly, just bigger proposals like get rid of all student debt, get rid of all medical debt, instead of creating a progressive but a new complicated means test system.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I really appreciate about your show is you're really good at, in a very concise way, messaging the difference between Bernie and Warren. And so Warren is a fantastic candidate, and I would 100% endorse her if Bernie weren't in this campaign. And it's because she's the reform candidate. Bernie's the power candidate. Bernie's not having a conversation about protecting workers or just simply protecting workers. He's having a conversation about empowering workers and giving them leverage in this economic system. And that's so incredibly important. And I feel like that's missing from a lot of the conversations that Warren's having. And so while, reform is all fine and dandy, the fact of the matter is the American worker has lost an increasing amount of power throughout, the last several decades. And I think that Bernie fighting to, create a better equilibrium is what is so appealing about him as a candidate. And you get the sense that this isn't just about him winning the primary and hopefully becoming president. This is about a greater movement. This is beyond Bernie. This is about inspiring people to go forward and push for what he's been fighting for decades, and that's really something inspiring to me. So that's the reason why I've endorsed him over Warren. And, I'm not interested in demonizing Warren. I do see some stuff on social media from Bernie Sanders supporters that I don't think is helpful at all to Bernie. In demonizing Warren. And I don't even know what percentage of Bernie Sanders supporters do it. I think it's a minuscule amount. They just happen to be the loudest. But we got to think long-term strategy, right? And if you care about long-term strategy, Bernie's the candidate for you. Definitely.
And also finding that balance, because there is dumb and destructive criticisms of her, but there's also been this notion that she can't be politically interrogated. And she can't be subjected. Yep. There's a lot of people that have somehow wanted Elizabeth Warren to you can run against her. You could maybe even have be bad enough to not vote for her, but obviously you never criticize her. So I think that's the other part of the dynamic is that a lot of people. Yeah. And that's another major danger, because we're also talking about somebody who outside of media circles is not hugely popular. Her numbers in Massachusetts, they're okay. They're not really great, especially for a Democrat in that state. Her head-to-heads against Trump, to the extent we're putting stock in them, and I think we can start thinking about them a little bit more now because we are actually having some exposure, they look bad. And so, I think that's what we're threading, because there's a lot of people who have demanded and kind of become religious in their own way that you can't criticize Warren. And that's actually really bizarre and unhelpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, I saw people who I have a lot of respect for getting angry that there was legitimate criticism about her proposal, right? And here's the thing. If you put out that proposal, you're opening yourself up to criticism, rightfully so. And look, part of the criticism isn't just, hey, we want to tear Warren down. It's about finding the flaws and hoping that she, puts out something better in terms of financing it, right? If there's a regressive tax in there, then she should know, hey, we recognize that this is a regressive tax and you should probably go in a different direction. So it's not just about criticizing her for the sake of criticizing her or undermining her. It's about hoping that she listens to the criticism and does better.
Right. Update the blog post. My last my last question, or two more questions. One real quick. We all know that we need, I would say, I don't even like the word amnesty. The 20 million people that live here need to just be given citizenship. That's my view. We need to conform with international law on refugees. These are profoundly important issues. And I think, frankly, if for several years, and you'd been working on this as Bernie Sanders has, and you made it part of the case going back decades that part of having a national health system is going to be on some level connected with passing comprehensive immigration reform, maybe. But I found it very odd that she also threw as a funding mechanism a tax on a path to citizenship. Because, one, I actually have some questions about a tax on a path to citizenship, if I understand it correctly to begin with. But two, it felt like, okay, there's a regressive tax, and now you're throwing in something that might be contingent on an entirely different legislative process. I don't know. That jumped out to me.
Well, there were two parts of her proposal that raised red flags for me, in terms of passing legislation or doing something legislatively in order to raise the revenue necessary to pay for Medicare for All. So, she notes that creating a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented immigrants in the United States will raise about $400 billion in revenue. So I'm guessing, although she's not specific, that she's referring to income taxes there, but I could be wrong.
Right.
So, I found that really odd too. Now, let me just note, $400 billion is really a drop in the bucket. So it's not as though, the survival of Medicare for All or the mere existence of it would really rely on passing comprehensive immigration reform. However, remember that she made a political calculation to avoid saying that she's going to raise middle-class taxes because in her mind, it's risky to say that. It's unpopular to say that. But then at the same time, she's decided to attach comprehensive immigration reform, a controversial issue, not for us, but a controversial issue overall for the country in order to raise the revenue for Medicare for All. Like, it's just a weird thing to note. And, going back to the defense that Representative Jayapal put out there, she's just basically saying, and so is Ryan Grimm, to be fair, that no, this is just Warren's way of showing the country where her values lie. I don't know. It was, in my opinion, a really weird explanation, and I don't know why she included comprehensive immigration reform in this proposal. It was strange. The other thing she mentioned was, and this isn't about raising revenue, it's more about saving money. She's saying, well, we need to stop spending so much money on defense, which is also a very difficult thing to sell. If you're trying to if you're going to attach it to Medicare for All and, use it as a way to accomplish the necessary funding for it. I don't know.
Antithetical to her record entirely.
Exactly.
Huge proponent of military spending and Raytheon. My final question for you, you and I both had the interpretation when we first read the blog post and we saw the phrase, I think long term was used 4 times in it. And maybe we weren't reading it charitably, but multiple people, not just you and I, said, oh, this sounds more like a Harris timeline. This isn't the 4 years of Sanders or the 2 years of Jayapal, to be fair. This sounds more like 10 years. Congresswoman Jayapal came out and said that this is completely false and so on. And so I think people like you and I are deferring to her because she wrote a bill and she has a lot of understanding of this. I reread it and I'm certainly not questioning her honesty. I'm just saying, like, are we just deferring to her as an authority, or is that like the correct reading? Because I'm frankly still a little confused on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I do really respect Representative Jayapal. She's a great progressive. And so I guess I'm going to defer to her. And Warren has been incredibly unclear. I mean, anyone who reads that Medium blog post, like, you don't leave with this idea that she's planning on a 4-year transition to Medicare for All. You leave thinking either it's going to take 10 years because her wording is incredibly confusing, right? Or you think to yourself, oh, she hasn't really worked that detail out yet, and so we'll find out later. But you don't come away thinking it's going to be a 4-year transition phase. So look, again, it's weird that this is the policy where it's like her Achilles heel, and I don't understand why. With everything else, she seems to be very detail-oriented. With Medicare for All, she isn't. And so she's saying that she's going to talk about the implementation of the policy in the coming weeks. Okay, that's fine. I don't want to be, too critical until she comes out with what that transition period will be, and I will defer to Representative Jayapal. But with that said, yeah, the fact that she kept referring to it as a long-term goal in her post makes me worry a little bit.
I agree with you 100%. I'm not, again, it's a balance. I'll defer to her expertise, but I also, I don't know. I mean, it also is like, it seemed like Warren surrogacy to me too. So I think we shouldn't necessarily just lay that down. I mean, final really quick question, and this is just super editorial, and this will piss some people off, and, take it or don't. But it's like a legitimate question to me, which is like, is part of what is causing so much agitation right now in this campaign cycle, at least with regards to the Sanders-Warren dynamic, is just, and this isn't just healthcare, it's certainly the totality of policy sets and ideas and vision, that a lot of people, it seems to me, are jumping through hoops to not say, yes, I might claim that I'm left or whatever, and I'm going to pick the more conservative option because of XYZ, which is, we would disagree, but it's more tenable. But jumping through hoops and coming up with like Rube Goldberg contortions to try to be like, what's obvious to everybody isn't actually true. One of these options is more progressive than the other. And it's funny because I get sick of that kind of discourse online in a way. I there's a problem with it in terms of purity tests and so on. But it's like, if you're left and you're voting in a presidential primary and you have two candidates that can win, you would pick the candidate who is left. And I feel like getting away from, there's a desire to make it more complicated than that is leading to a lot of even people I have like a huge amount of respect for, not making bad arguments per se, but kind of like going out into the field in a way that they would never for any other candidate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely noticing that as well. I mean, like, I'll address the elephant in the room. Like, Cenk and I have these disagreements on the show on a regular basis. And look, I really think that in a lot of ways, Cenk is honest. I mean, he likes the capitalism talk. He identifies as a capitalist, and he's been upfront and open and honest about that. And I don't know, maybe I've been watching too much of your show because I've moved further to the left, and I've really reconsidered just this economic structure that we have in the country and how reform just isn't good enough. And so I've moved further to the left. He's always identified as a capitalist. And so I think that that's where our disagreement really lies, although we haven't gotten into a detailed conversation about that yet. Right. And so, for instance, when Bernie came out with his housing plan, I loved it. And Cenk, I just remember one sentence he said really well. He was like, yeah, Bernie's officially moved to the left of me. Now, in reality, Bernie's always been to the left of him, right? But it's those types of policies that are very appealing to me, but might turn, someone like Cenk off a little bit.
I think he'd fit in the first category, actually, of just, I'm genuinely at a different place politically. It's when I hear people who are like, well, you don't know, maybe she's secretly amazing on Israel, Palestine. It's like, she's not, just relax.
I don't, I don't know what's in their mind and why they, jump through hoops
Right.
in regards to those types of policy issues, but they do, and it's strange. And let me just note, she hasn't put out anything in regard to foreign policy, nothing. And that is also a weakness if you look at her record. So she really does need to, if she wants to win over progressives, she really does need to talk a little more about what she plans on doing when it comes to cutting defense spending. I mean, her record doesn't bear that out. So if she says she's going to cut defense spending to help pay for Medicare for All, she needs to be a little more specific.
Anna, as always, I learned so much from you. Everybody should check out No Filter. And of course, Anna on the Mega Network, the Godfather Network, TYT. There's only one thing that I have a problem with that you said, which you said maybe you're watching too much of my show. And obviously that could never be true.
No, never. I love your show, and I learn a lot from you. So thank you. And I especially love the post games with the debunked segments because Ben Burgess is amazing. But more importantly, that intro song for him is it's the best.
Ana Kasparian, you're awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael.
Anna, thanks. We're going to roll this tomorrow. I'll see you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Take care. Bye. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.